and Standards Committee. So if we start off with agenda item 1, so that is our minutes. So to authorise the chairman to sign the minutes of the meeting, Audit and Standards Committee held on the 21st of June 21 as a correct record of proceedings. All happy with that? Yeah. Okay, that's one, thank you. Okay, thank you. Agenda item 2, apologies for absence, Louise.
Chairman, we've got Councillors Barnes and Mrs Barnes and Councillor.
Lovely, thank you. Additional agenda items. I don't believe we have any additional. No additional items. Thank you. Okay, so agenda item 4, disclosures of interest. So to receive any disclosure by members of any personal and disclosable pecuniary interest in matters on the agenda, nature of any interest, whether the members regard personal interest as prejudicial under the terms of the Code of Conduct. Members are reminded of the need to repeat their declaration immediately prior to the commencement of the item in question. So do we have any disclosures of interest today? Lovely, thank you. Okay, so we have no standards reports this evening, so we'll move straight on to part B, which is our audit. And agenda item number 5, first up, is our report of the external auditors, Grant Thornton, Audit Plan 2021. And if I can hand over to Trevor, please.
Thank you, Chair. So the audit plan gives a summary of the work that we propose to give our opinion on the financial statement and our value for money. So I think what I will do is run through the plan and just comment on pages. So page 3, key matters, is the summary of the context, if you like, for you as a council. It says something about the impact of COVID. It says something about your financial position. Those things in themselves do not dictate what we would necessarily do for our opinion work, but what they do perhaps provide a context for what we do under value for money. It's likely that we will look at your financial position and some of the experiences, some of the forecast issues that you face. Move on then to significant risks, which is slide 6, or page 6. So our audit is risk-based, and we identify risks that effectively are the focus for our work. And we use the term significant and other risks. Those have implications for our audit approach and our testing, but they don't have any significance perhaps for others. The significant risks that we've identified for rather are all risks that we would identify for local authorities generally. So essentially we focus our work on the largest items, the items which have significant estimation, and that's things like the valuation of your property assets and valuation of your net pensions liability. So there's nothing specific to rather, no concern or no particular issue which is driving us to have a risk that would be specific. One thing that is different this year, but again is common across authorities. We've identified a risk on page 8 around the accounting for COVID grants, and that's because in the context of the pandemic, we've received quite a lot of grant income. Some of that has been effectively passed through grant, where you're acting as a post box to distribute grant to others, and some of that is grant to support the activities of the council. And depending on the nature of the grant, that will dictate its accounting treatment. And there have been quite a lot of grants. There are obviously some big headline items, but there have been some small grants, and the decision as to how to account for can actually be quite complex. So we've identified a risk that we just need to look at the account for you and others as to how you do that. I'm not expecting it to be a particular problem for all, but it's something. going to say something very briefly on slide 9, which is accounting estimates. So there has been a revision of one of the auditing standards, ISO 540, on the work required around accounting estimates. And accounting estimates are things like your evaluation processes, and also where you have provisions or accruals, how do you actually calculate? And what this revision requires is more work around these estimates, more work for us in terms of understanding how you calculate these estimates, the decisions that management make, and potentially if things were complicated or controversial, what involvement there would be from members in those decisions. So there's additional work involved for us, and we will ask you as management, finance team, we will ask you additional information. I don't, again, think that this is going to be a big problem or an issue of concern, because the sort of estimate we're talking about for you as other local authorities are things that you're familiar with. These valuation processes are things that happen every year. So we're not expecting there to be significant problems. Nevertheless, we're going to. Go on then to page 14, which is value for money. National Audit Office periodically review the Code of Audit Practice, and they have reviewed it for the 2021 year. And one of the changes they've made is around the expectations for the work auditors would do on value for money. And the slide explains the main differences compared with the previous year. But essentially, what's expected is that historically we would have reported by exception. So if we looked at your arrangements and we thought there was something of particular concern, that would be where we would focus our work, and that would be how we would report. And typically we would have sort of a yes/no answer. Your value for money conclusion would be qualified or unqualified. So we what people describe as a binary arrangement. It would be a very black and white approach. Under this new structure, what we're expected to do is comment more widely on your arrangements, and there's 3 areas that we're expected to comment on. They include improving economy, efficiency, and effectiveness, financial sustainability, and your governance arrangements. So we're expected to say something about those, irrespective of whether we think there's a problem, and therefore what we will do will be different in scope from what we've done before. There'll probably be a longer report, larger output in that work, and we probably will have to ask you for more information in some areas where, if it hasn't been a problem, we haven't had to look at it in detail before, but this structure we will. So again, there'll be some more work on that. Under the structure, what we're expected to do is say, at the planning stage, do we think you have any significant weaknesses? And we've concluded that you don't currently, in our view, have any significant weaknesses, value for money in terms of tier we're meant to assess. We thought about your financial position and your financial sustainability. But what we're looking here at the 2021 year, we've looked ahead at your medium-term plan. You've obviously got some significant pressures there. But at the same time, you have quite a robust planning framework. You update that regularly. You've a clear approach to budgeting and financial planning. So we decided that at this point, the situation doesn't require us to identify significant weakness, but it is an area where we just will have to update our understanding again, as we have in the previous year. And it's possible, of course, as we go through the work, either in that area or any other area, we might identify something that we consider was a significant weakness, and then that's what we will report. So the only other slide I think I'll touch on is slide 18, which is the audit fees. where there's significant, I use the word significant, there's an increase on the previous year, and that reflects some of the issues I've talked about. So the value for money work expects us to do more work, and that's reflected in the fee. And again, the work on some of the accounting standards, the changes to audit standards, again, require more from us. I mentioned the estimates one. There's an appendix at the end here which sort of has a long list of standards which change, and they work their way through into our work. But in many ways, the change is something that would be internal for us in terms of how we report things and how we plan things. It won't necessarily be something, but it has an impact on us. I'm not sure. So that's our audit plan. Take any questions?
I have a number of questions. Would you like me to state them one at a time? You can answer them one at a time. We'll rattle through them all.
Well, I may not remember them. There are a lot. So I think it's better if we do them one at a time.
Okay. On page 3, and I don't think this is possibly a matter for you, it may be internal rule for us. And you've got key matters and factors, the main factors affecting our financial position. Unfortunately, there's a bold typing of page 3, which is blocking some quite important figures in millions of pounds. And I don't know whether that's something that's been inserted within the council after this report came. I apologise, they're my fault. Thank you. My next area is on page 10. I'm just clicking through to it.
Sorry. Just online there. Sorry, I was just trying to help Councillor Cortell. The numbers on page 3, I do recognise those numbers. If it helps, I can tell you what they are now. So the leading to a reduction in the planned level of funding, you have also received significant additional funding totaling 2,813. So that's a 2. That's 2.8 million, and the number below it is 300. Should be 367,000.
Moving on to page 10. Sorry, I'm just trying to get through the pages again. It states that we are supposed to understand certain concepts as as members of this committee in terms of financial modelling and so on. I have to say that I don't know how things are financially modelled within ROBA, and I can't therefore say that I understand something that I'm supposed to understand and accept or agree to.
So I think the context here is if there are estimates of them. So obviously there can be a range of potentially to calculate the figure, and they can be of various types, but sometimes things are not easily identified from what we call market data. So if something is out in the world and there's a price on it, you can use that perhaps as a reference point for your own calculation. Sometimes if you have something which you're doing yourselves, it's unique to you or not similar to other things, you're having perhaps to do modelling which hasn't been done elsewhere, and in that context, you're having to make some assumptions. The more that you're at that end of the range, if I can call it like that, then the more the greater risk, I guess, that the complexity might lead to error. And if those numbers were big enough, then that's the sort of figure in the accounts that potentially those charged with governments, the audit committee, and others responsible should understand. And it's complicated, then it would be for management to do it the way that will allow you to understand. But I don't think that you currently have anything of that kind. So I think the things, the estimates that are the large estimates for you are things around property valuations, pensions, which are things where there's an established way of doing it, where there's not a significant change year on year, where you do have information side, where you use external people, external valuers, actuaries to assist you. And so I don't think at the moment there are likely to be or will be any estimates and accounts which would require you to understand some. I don't see that.
Thank you very much.
So just to follow up on that, Chair, sorry. I can't remember which committee meeting it was, but as a matter of course, every year we do take a report to the committee laying out what our accounting policies are. So you might get a bit more information from that if you refer back to that report. I think it was written. Sorry, I can't remember which committee it was. Might have been the last one or one before then. We produce that report every year. It's quite a dry document in truth, but it might give members additional information should they want it.
Thank you. I was perhaps naively just trying to fulfil my function as a member of this committee of understanding, but thank you. Moving on to page 17. I'll click through. Sorry, I do apologise. Page 12. Page 12 says, giving electors the opportunity to raise questions about 2020, 2021 financial statements. My question is, when can electors raise questions and how?
I'm happy to answer that, but Tony can also. That's fine.
Yeah, the accounts were published on the website yesterday. There's a month period, it's called the inspection period, commonly referred to it as, and the opportunity for electors to engage and review and ask questions is now running live as we speak.
Thank you. My next question relates to the audit fee. The contract was for £37,000. There's an additional 9,000, taking us to 45,000 this year due to the additional work the government is requiring to do. And then next year it's projected at £60,000, which is a 33%. Now I realise that the value for money project is included in next year's, and possibly you haven't. I don't know whether you were required to do it this year or whether you waived some of the fees, but it just seems such an enormous increase. I think our residents would probably like to understand why this increase is necessary.
Well, the fee is driven by the work. So the scale fee was established several years ago, and since then there's been a number of changes in the accounting and auditing world. The main change is effectively the reports by regulators of the Financial Reporting Council which for all audit firms have required them to do additional work. That's particularly true for auditors where we're talking about their review of property valuation, or the estimate that accounts for property valuation, and the pension liability, where there's been a significant increase in the amount of work that would be expected in this area. So those are changes to the situation that was the position for the scale fee, and it's simply not possible to do that extra work without increasing. So that's reflected. In terms of the EFM code, this is the first year, so 2021, the year just passed. This is very slightly confusing, but our audit is for our work in the accounts, which you have just published for the 2021 financial year. So this will be the first year that the value for money work applies. The changes in respect of the auditing standards, again, this is the first year that applies. But those changes also involve additional work, and those requirements and expectations are made for us, and we can't do anything but follow them. We are obliged to work to the framework set by the FRC. That's the obligation.
Thank you.
Hello, Chair. I also had a number of questions, probably best one by one. The first one is just simply that I just don't know the meaning of the phrase. And the phrase is planning materiality, and a figure of 990,000 given that. I'm sorry, I just don't even know what that means. I'll be grateful.
So auditors use a concept of materiality, and indeed the accounts use the concept of materiality. So what is materiality? Materiality is an attempt to measure significance. So if you were an ordinary reader and you were looking at the accounts, what sort of thing, what would be the extent of an error or a mistake that would actually mislead you? So if the figure was 100,000 and it was wrong by a pound, it wouldn't affect your understanding. Still understand what was the size of certain things and what had happened. But if 100,000 was 40,000, everyone would probably agree that was something corrected and potentially could be. So auditors use this concept of materiality to assess what would be the level of error that potentially could mislead you. There are different ways of doing it. There's a quantitative measure and there's a qualitative measure. Certain things may not have a big monetary impact, but they might still be. So essentially, materiality is this our measure of what we think could mislead a reader. And our objective is to view the accounts and confirm or otherwise if there are any material mistakes. Are there any errors of that size in the account? We obviously perform our work to establish that there aren't, and therefore whenever it's published, there are no errors of that.
Thank you very much. That's explaining what it is. My next question is the obvious follow-up to that. The figure of 992,000 to a layperson like myself seems quite a large margin of error. But what does that figure mean? How is it arrived at?
So the approach to calculating materiality involves deciding what benchmark you do. So typically that could be income or expenditure, or it could be value of assets. There are different things, and they vary depending on different type of organization. So in this case, as a public sector organization, probably what most people read is how much money you spend and what did you do. So they're probably not interested in the size of your value of your property assets or the value of your pensions. So, but they are probably interested in how much money you spend. So we use expenditure, the expenditure as a starting point, benchmark. And then we worked to, I guess, industry standards in a way. There's a range of materiality. And we were a different organization, a commercial organization. The percentage of the benchmark we would apply might be 3%, 4%, 5%. As a public sector organization, we used a figure of 2%. And that probably is an industry standard. If someone sitting here was from PwC or BDO or another accounting firm, they were talking to you, their figure might not be 2%, but it might be 1.5% or 2.5%. It's a measure that's fairly consistent across the firms. That's not an absolute figure, so we would take into account, for example, our experience of working with you and the outcomes of previous audits. If we had a history of finding a lot of errors, then that would affect our figure. But in your case, that's not the case. So our figure is based on 2% of the gross spend.
I see. So as we spend about 45 million a year, that's about 2% of that. And so that figure reflects, if you like, your confidence that our figures are usually fairly reliable.
Yes.
Okay. I think that's great. Okay, now other questions. My next question is about how much money, and I'm not clear of the relationship between the deficit that the council is running and the amount of money that's being taken out of the reserve. Again, it's my lack of financial expertise, no doubt, coming out here. So you on page 3, you talk about reporting a deficit of 1,284,000, of which 167,000 is unplanned. But then later on, you talk about page 4, the contribution from reserves of 3,319,000. Now, why are we having to take more out of reserve than the deficit? Please.
Well, these are your figures, and I would say something rather than doing that comment. So the first one, the deficit of 1,284, which 367 was unplanned. When you originally set the budget in 2021, you were anticipating that you would have to make a contribution to your reserves in order to fund expenditure, and you set that figure at 970,000. So the actual outcome at the end of the year, because of the impact of COVID, essentially, was that you had a higher deficit than expected, and therefore your total deficit was 1,284. So that's the relationship between those two figures. There was an original budgeted deficit, and then there was a additional unplanned deficit. The impact of COVID on it.
I see. So it's a question of this is what we were planning for, but then because of COVID, the figure had to go high. My next question is about, you refer to the medium-term financial strategy and the Council's financial stability programme, but I don't think you give any figures to what contribution you're expecting them to make. Is that something which you would expect to see in a report of this sort, or is that the sort of thing you see in a different sort of report at a different time?
So it's not in my report because that's not going to drive our work. So it's our plan, and that's information, it's context, but not necessarily going to drive. And it's not a particular risk that we have to respond to. Don't know if you're wrong.
Sorry, yeah. The this relates really to the work that we discussed a bit earlier. So Thomas, and it's around the medium-term financial plan. We took the medium-term financial plan to members back in February. The projection went up to the financial year 25-26, I think. So the numbers are there, but clearly that document's now 6 months old. So the world has moved on since then, and we'll be revamping or revising that. The new iteration of the medium-term plan will be reported to members in the next few weeks.
Thank you. And my next question, that's my ignorance there, I should have kept up with that. And the next question may be the same, revealing some ignorance when I shouldn't be. You've got on page 25, you've got references to the usual reserves and the total reserves. How great are they at the present time? What are the reserves at the moment, both usable?
the usable reserves I don't have that number in front of me, but the usable reserves at the end of the current financial year 2021, I think are about 10 or 11 million. And I apologise, I can't be any more precise than that at this stage. Because I just don't have the information in front of me. But again, we have reported that information to Overview and Scrutiny Committee. But I think it's that order.
Thank you. And just my last question. How does our position compare with that of other councils of similar size or councils affected by the COVID crisis? How are we getting on with other?
I think from an audit point of view, it's difficult for me to say anything meaningful on that. There isn't data that I'm aware of which actually compares the impact specifically of COVID. Obviously, COVID year has been 2021. People are just starting to publish accounts, so they have to publish accounts at the end of July, but most people publish fairly recently. So the opportunity to gather data and do some kind of comparative exercise, I don't think it's there yet. From the sets of accounts that I have seen, I think there's a range. Some people have actually made a small surplus because that's just how the balance of things work out for them in terms of government grant versus the income. Others have had a more significant deficit than you would have. So I think it's quite difficult to generalise. There's probably nothing I can say that would be really meaningful.
And I just finish then by thanking you for a report that I found very easy to read, or relatively easy to read and understand. And thank you for writing it in the kind of English that makes that possible. So I'm grateful for that.
Sure. Yeah, can I just add something which might help members with regards to the reserves and suitability levels? I mean, as Trevor's pretty much said, there's no definitive answer, but we have recently received a copy of what CIPA had published, which they call the Financial Resilience Index, and our intention is to do a bit more work around that and bring that into reports to members to give a more informed picture of the level of our reserves and how they may compare to authorities in our comparator group. And that's not necessarily neighbouring authorities. It could be, I think one of our comparators, for example, is Timbridge in South Devon. So we're looking to expand on that bit of work going forward, and so I hope we give members a bit more information around what the position of our reserves is and what the state of our reserves is in comparison to others. But it is very difficult, as Trevor says, to come up with a definitive right or right. It's not like a league table that you can see that we're in the relegation zone or something like that. It's not quite as simple as that.
It's a very, very, very uncertain situation. We and other councils are in the business. But thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Yeah, so the statement of accounts, just to sort of give a bit of background information that hopefully members will find useful. It's a statutory document, hence that's why we employ Trevor and his company to do the audit for us. So we have to do that by law. The accounts are currently published on the website, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, so they're open for inspection. I suppose our aim as a council really is ultimately to get a set of unqualified accounts or an unqualified audit opinion from our auditors. So that was basically saying to the Rother Council taxpayer, we've got a set of accounts here that give a true and fair view of the financial position of the authority as at the 31st of March 2021. There's literally dozens of pages in the accounts. What I'll do is just go through the key statements in the accounts and enlarge them a little bit. The first one is the movement in reserve statement. This basically shows our changes in our reserves balances. And our reserves are made up of two things really. One is usable reserves. They you like, represent real cash. And then there's unusable reserves, which don't represent cash, but if you like, unrealised cash. And a good example of that would be the fixed asset, it's not fixed asset restatement reserve, but the revaluation reserve, you might know it as in the private sector, whereby if a value of an asset has been upwardly valued at £50,000, then as an organisation, we're £50,000 better off, but that cash isn't yet realised because we clearly haven't sold the asset. So that's the draw distinction between the two types of reserves. The next statement is called the Comprehensive Income and Expenditure Statement. This reflects the council's financial performance, but it reflects it, if you like, under sort of private sector accounting rules. So it's a different document to what we report to Cabinet each quarter, which is essentially a management account, which effectively reports our cash position. So you will have quite a lot of entries in the CIES that are non-cash entries, if you like. So that's to try and draw a distinction for members between the two documents, if you're wondering why we have the two documents. The balance sheet, that shows the council's financial health as at the 31st of March 2021 in this case. That is common across every single organisation that reports accounts for the year. Our net worth has decreased by 7.6 million year on year, and this is mainly because of a revaluation in fixed assets and an increase in the pensions deficit. It's still a strong balance sheet, and that's an important point to make, especially if we're dealing with potential suppliers, for example, or banking institutions who will look at the strength of our may look at the strength of our balance sheet before they decide to deal with us or to do business with us. So it is, whilst it has decreased, it's still a strong looking balance sheet. However, I guess the one thing that would be worth pointing out at this stage, and I'll do this throughout the financial year, we still need to deliver savings and balance that budget. That the need to do that is still there and hasn't gone away, regardless of the strength of our balance sheet. The last two statements, the cash flow statement, it pretty much does what it says on the tin. It helps the user ascertain how well a council manages its cash position. So our bottom line surplus deficit in this case isn't necessarily made up of debtors accruals, for example, or money that hasn't yet come in. It's our bank account. It actually takes out all those entries and just shows the true movement of cash through our accounts. And again, it's usually quite an interesting document for potential suppliers to look at, because they can see whether the organisation is managing its cash properly before they decide to engage and transact with the organisation. So that's what the cash flow statement is. Finally, the collection fund. This is a strange one to explain. It's required by law, so it's not just something that we've decided to do. Rather, it's something that all councils have to do. It's required by law to collect council tax and business rates income. And it's a different account to the general fund account or the revenue account, those terms that we've used in the past. It's a different account altogether. I think Trevor might have mentioned it in his report, but you'll see from our accounts that there's a huge deficit of £13 million on the collection fund. Now, that's not as scary as it sounds. It's because if you recall at the beginning of the pandemic, business rates were effectively suspended and businesses were given business grants, and local authorities, instead of receiving business rates income from businesses, that was replaced by what we call Section 31 grant income from government. So what we lost in business rates was replaced penny for penny by Section 31 grants. The reason why it shows a huge deficit is because the Section 31 grants have to be accounted for via the general fund rather than collection fund. So you have this massive imbalance between the two. So we actually did have a big surplus on the general fund account, but that surplus and a big deficit on the collection fund account. A big chunk of that deficit relates to our preceptors, East Sussex County Fire Brigade, Fire Service rather than the police. So it's not all our deficit anyway. Rother was left at the end of the financial year, I think out of the £11 million or so that we got through Section 31 grants, about £4.5 million of it was extra grant for Rother. And that will be that's used effectively to offset the loss in NNDR income that we suffered in the 2021 financial year. The council tax bit of the deficit is much smaller, it's 1.3 million, and about 10% of that relates to Rother, and we're able to spread that deficit over 3 financial years. Furthermore, we have got some covering of that by central government by way of a grant, and we expect to receive about 55,000 for that. So the net impact on the council will roughly be about £23,000 per annum for the next 3 years. I hope that explanation was helpful, but I understand if you need to ask questions because it's very tricky to explain. But I think to sum up, yes, there's a big deficit on the collection fund, but it's largely offset by the fact that we have more money in the general fund, and we need to take that money out of the general fund and put it in a reserve, in a sense, so that we don't think it's spare money for us, because we have to pay that money over to our preceptors. And we also have to use it to offset the deficit in the collection fund. So it's not a bad news story, but it's not a good news story either. Yeah, so that's it, Chair. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Councillor Kirby-Green.
Thank you. That was really helpful to me because you actually answered a couple of questions I was actually going to raise. So thank you very much. May I just ask 2 questions? And one is probably maybe an event. The first one is, if you don't mind me, presumably you have written a narrative as well. Yeah. When you've referred to summary of achievements, dedicated staff resources to deliver the strategy, that's the environment strategy. Yeah? So could you just explain what that means, dedicated staff resources? Sorry, page 4. Page 4, sorry, under summary of achievements, it refers to the environment strategy. The first line says dedicated staff resources to deliver the strategy. What exactly were the staff resources? Oh, right. Oh, sorry, that's on kind of. It's a leading question because I'd heard along the grapevine, I haven't heard it officially, but we don't. The person we recruited to do that actually isn't here anymore. So I wasn't sure whether that was necessary. Something
as at the balance sheet date, 31st of March, obviously we had somebody in post. The post exists, still exists today, but obviously you're aware the person who occupied the post.
I'd only heard about 50 pounds. That is, but it is vacant.
Yes, the post currently vacant. Yes, only recently. But so at the balance sheet date, that post was filled, and the post exists in that budget.
It was just, but it's just that one post. There weren't, when it said, I just wanted to check there weren't more than one. It's just one. Yeah. And then the other question I had, and again, this may be me being a bit dense. It was about staffing. So on page 10, I'm trying to work out the difference between posts and employees, given we haven't got any job share employees. So I'm trying to work out how we've got a different number of posts and employees. Sorry, that's a bit we didn't do. Because it says, yeah, we've got 230 employees. So 235, but then 240. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind just clarifying that, because I couldn't quite get the numbers to add up. But I'm sure it's me, it's just my lack of knowledge. Yeah, absolutely. But the full-time equivalents are different.
I think Chairman just maybe the answer is that there were vacant posts at the end of the year, so we have a number of employees employed, people 35 expresses full-time equivalents, so 272 number of employees in the table, and the actual posts we have 267, so 5 vacancies.
Sorry, thank you very much. Yeah, I couldn't quite work that out. Thank you. Oh, and then sorry, one last question. Short-term sickness. Really interesting that it went down substantially in 2021. I've got my own suspicion as to why that might be. I wonder whether you have any views as to why that might be. Because that is quite, I mean, 0.76 is very, very, very low. And I just wondered, is it because people working from home so they don't have to miss it? Is that a bit harsh?
I mean, I think part of it is, clearly, I haven't had a cold for 18 months.
Oh, right.
I don't know about you.
anything else.
But I
You're
don't
not-
think it's been healthy. I think we have done a number of staff surveys, and we're just currently undertaking a staff survey again, just to understand people's health. Because obviously, I think that the hidden issue might be mental health. That's what we're trying to ascertain really at the moment. Mental health. Part of the pandemic, we put in place mental first aiders, so people that would support people when they were struggling, particularly from working at home and being isolated.
Yeah.
So we've done a lot of work around that. I think that kind of reflects the result there that the actual big phase is actually.
No, that's really good because I mean, yes, because actually, if you're working from home, it's just a matter of maybe there's sickness that hasn't been noted, yeah, because people haven't rung in, but they're actually ill. They're still ill.
There may well be hidden illness,
Yeah.
as you say. That's definitely
That's
a
low,
question
isn't
to
it?
ask.
0.76.
But I do say, I think, given the way we've all been living, clearly, but I haven't been exposed to the germs so much. Yeah, I had grandchildren around last night, so I was very nervous. Obviously, they're in 6 and 7.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. I think, Tony, you've produced an excellent 2.5-page overview, and you've put the main concepts over very well. I am a bit concerned, though, that as at last night on my iPad, I only had the 2.5-page overview. And then this morning, the 88 pages of financial accounts, and I have not had time to read the additional 88 pages. And I wonder whether this section of the report could be deferred for noting until an additional meeting, perhaps in a couple of weeks' time, when or whenever the chair feels is appropriate, so that we can actually go through these in more detail.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. I can only apologise about the lateness of the numbers getting onto the agenda. It's difficult at the moment with trying to, with so much going on. But the main thing is we have got them on the website. They're out for public consumption and so forth. I mean, the report is for noting. I totally understand what you're saying, Councillor. I have no view on necessarily whether you require a follow-up meeting, but I'm more than happy to field any questions that you might want to submit to me at later dates.
Yeah, and also just to clarify, obviously, Trevor and his team will undertake their work through the audit, and then the actual statement will come back to this final approval, and sign off on that account. There's another opportunity for a formal meeting, but as Tony said, we're quite happy to answer any questions in the interim, but also if members wanted to have a session together, again, something like that, then we can support that.
Thank you.
Sorry. I've got a series of questions on the actual accounts, if you'll bear with me. May I do them one at a time? Otherwise, it starts to get confusing if I try and run through them. On your page 11, Tony, your general fund information. Am I right in concluding, although it looks like you didn't do very well because of the pandemic, if I look at the net cost of services, the variance is just over 2 million, and we received 2.8 million from government for COVID support grants. So we actually took 500,000 less from the reserves than your revised budget said you would. So there tends to be doom and gloom about it, where it doesn't look like that at all.
Well, no, I think that in the report that went to scrutiny committee, we had a chance to see that. So there was a shortfall in what we received in government grant, what we felt we spent on COVID related pandemic response, and that was around about 485,000 short. So you might argue that's not a big hole compared to what some councils suffered. It's not for me to say one way or the other. but we did have, we did spend more than we expected to because of the pandemic response. It wasn't fully funded.
You did take less from reserves. Your budget said you would. Why is that? The revised budget
Yeah.
said you would take 2.2 million. You only took 1.7.
Yeah, that's true. Yes.
And that's mainly because you got 2.8 million from the government.
I'm not arguing with that. You're right in what you're saying, Patrick.
So I just feel that, the impression is given that pandemic was awful, that our finances are much worse because of it, but that isn't supported by the account.
I'm just very right. I think it's less worse than you thought it was. You're correct.
All right, okay.
But we're accountants, so we'll make it less worse.
The other bit is, my next question is on the medium-term financial plan, which does look at making some very significant savings with this service prioritisation and devolvement, which I think I had discussed with you before about it. It does ask for an awful lot of savings and the acquisition and transformation. Has the council got any history of being able to achieve savings at this level? Because it does look very ambitious to me.
Chairman, yes, we've survived since 2010. Reduction in our government funding and find savings and additional income to replace the loss income government over it. We've got a track record of that. I think the challenge going forward is even more to ask of us, so we have to be more creative. And this is where, as you say, there's a big reliance on the programme on our parish and town council partners taking up some of those services we currently provide discretionary. But if we do not replace that funding or find another organisation that have done are seriously at risk, because I think most members are probably already aware that our real issue in the last 2 years has been the waste contract, which take into account the loss of revenue and council credits, costing us something like 2.1 million. That's the real issue for us now. We've kind of dealt with government funding, but we deal now with waste contract. So they are ambitious targets, definitely. But we have a programme of delivery. We have a track record of against those. Confident will. That's why I'm not as confident about time. MTFP assumed it would happen in a year. And I think after the pandemic, now stretched out down the road. So there's a little bit of good news in the sense of not incurring the costs of foreign investments. A little bit of relief early they rely on income. It's only in the working on those plans again. Stand. But as I say, in terms of our previous track record, we lost some time in 50% of our government. So start then managed to deal with that well through 2 restructures. Savings further but there's likely to be further savings. Ultimately, it will come down to very difficult so what priority? Difficult time, but I'm confident.
Your comment.
It's got,
It's good to hear.
got a history,
You're confident
we've got a history.
that be achieved. My next question is about the huge increase on the capital programme and the risk that that poses, and whether or not this committee feels there needs to be some additional level of monitoring over what is normally done to counterbalance that risk.
Yeah, I mean, we as I say, we've been very open around the ambition of the capital programme. I think the next report on the agenda, the Treasury Management Report, is the first time that we've started reporting the capital programme in such detail. It's not been up before the committee or standards committee members before. So I think we're hopefully achieving that by expanding the remit, if you like, of the Treasury Management Report.
So, I mean, in terms of the actual scale of it, so what we're perhaps what this committee needs to see what processes happen around those investments. We work work with the property investment panel as well. How they assess officers' investment returns those will make. Tend to operate on a very basis that we secure property, secure the independent board best. So some security based before. On the housing side, especially through our homes brother, then authority, then company develop the property site proposals, those assets not be held by time, develop old ideas by this local housing association or to market. So the authority would then not on the thing until so there are, you're right, I think this committee needs to have an oversight of what's going on in terms of the programme, in terms of investment and risk. I want to reassure you tonight, though, there are lots of processes in place for this product.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking so much about that process as the fact that there's going to be some big capital building projects which are notorious in the public sector for skipping on timescale or cost. I'm wondering what monitoring of that timescale and cost, because there is the mission report of lack of project management skill in terms of some of the staff who can't manage the project.
I think, well, to be fair, actually, the two main officers are project trained. So project management, I think that was mentioned earlier, a training session. Project management advice important to people primarily involved in major capital projects. So we can reassure members by doing that. Management ongoing also relies on how you procure. So some of the more commercial development proposals being on a fixed fee basis rather than a authorities taking a level of risk, paying slightly more for the product, but the companies taking more risk. So that's kind of where we try and cap our costs as we can. Projects process where we have our investment partner.
It would be useful if we could see that information in the reports that come in. So, it gives members that assurance, doesn't it, that this project is on a fixed price basis is great.
I mean, once contracts are signed and in terms of confidentiality.
Okay. Coming on to the balance sheet, I notice there's a very significant increase in short-term debtors and short-term creditors. Can you explain the reason for that? Page 36.
Right.
So what page is that?
Page 36. It might be 35. It's overprinted.
Okay.
While you look at that information, Councillor Kirby Green, you wanted to interject that last thing.
I wanted to absolutely back what Patrick's saying. I mean, we only have to look at private eye every month and see the disasters in the public sector with house building and Norfolk County Council recently had a disaster in Burwell, which is in my ward. And so I think we absolutely need to have as much oversight. I would just like to support your comment that I think we do need some more oversight of those capital things, so that people like you, who's obviously a lot more experienced at this than me, for instance, and we are getting that oversight. So I just wanted to say I'm absolutely 100% with you on that comment.
I think, again, what we can do is probably put something on 4 members session and scale of the project, what investment are likely to deliver at the end of the day, what the risks are, and we can talk to the actual project manager. That's a more active way to actually go through. Right.
So back to my question.
Yeah, the increase in short-term debtors, Chair, will be around. We had a big chunk of money given to the council at the beginning of the pandemic to pay for business grants to small businesses in the hospitality sector. These were the £10,000, £25,000 grants. We didn't use all that money. We didn't give that money back to the EIS government department until June. So that was about £7 or £8 million. So that will probably explain the difference between the creditors, why there's an increase in creditors. That money was owed by the council back to central government. The debtors, I'm sorry, I don't know off the top of my head. I'll have to come back to the committee on that one.
It seems to have doubled. So yeah, more of double. Okay. I think that's the end of my questions. Thank you. That would be so many.
Do we have any further questions on the statement of Councillor Courtell?
Just a question concerning what the farmer said about the COVID situation. Is my understanding correct that we as a council are in deficit by about £500,000, which is not being funded by government?
Yes, Chair, that's correct.
Thank you.
So I should, I'm probably worth, for the sake of clarity, should add at this point, Chair, that some of the judgments around what is shortfalls in income, shall we say, for example, that have resulted from COVID and haven't resulted from COVID, it's not an exact science. I don't want members to go around thinking we've got this little calculator that easily tells us the answer. Some of it is a bit of a subjective judgment on many occasions, on many instances. Planning income, I think, is probably one such example. So that's our best estimate that we think we were short by, but it is not an exact science. And we've got the numbers to back it up, but as I say, it's not a precise science.
Finally, can I move that as some members of this committee, including myself, haven't had an opportunity to read through the 88 pages of the accounts since this morning, that we empower you, Chair, if following representations from various councillors, you consider it reasonable that we have a further meeting specifically on the accounts.
Could I suggest, following on from that, Chair, that perhaps if it's a written question via emails, which we were all included in, with consequent a similar reply to us all, and that might save extra time coming in and sitting here, or possibly arriving and find we've only got one question.
I agree with you. I think that would be the best way forward that you outlined.
Yeah, okay, great, that's noted, thank you. So if we can now move on to the Treasury Management update. So again, that was a document that was forwarded separately. So hopefully everyone has received that, and if I hand over to Tony to talk through this report, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Hopefully this was a little bit easier to follow than the last report in terms of the level of detail. So these are our standard quarterly reports that we bring to Audit Committee around the Council's Treasury Management activities. We will send these reports throughout the financial year, and this is the first one for 2021-22. I have changed the sort of format of the report from what has traditionally been reported to members. All the numerical information and data is in the appendices of the report. And what I hoped are the more punchy points, if you like, of the report are actually in the first 2 or 3 pages of it. So if you want to see the detail, you've got it there in the appendices. If you just want to focus in on the headlines, that's hopefully easier to find your way around the report, and you can see them in there. So in terms of investments, there's very little change from Q4. I think we reported £32 million last time, and it's still £32 million. That's what I've mentioned in paragraph 3. And again, Appendix A, that has the investment portfolio for the council, and that hasn't changed in terms of who we're basing our money with. As a small point, in the interest income budget, we anticipate revising that slightly upwards from the budget of 324,000 to 350,000 this year, as a result of even continuing improvement in performance of our property investment funds. As I say, that budget would have been set back in February amidst a quite uncertain time. So the change so early on in the year is understandable in that respect, and certainly points to a more positive outturn for us. Borrowing activity, that remains unchanged. As I said a few times now, and the council is looking to accelerate capital spend in 21-22, as hopefully members know by now. Although we can't rule out the fact that the pandemic may continue to weigh down its progress to a certain extent. And Appendix B shows what our current debt portfolio is and what we think our likely borrowing requirement or capital financing requirement is likely to be in the forthcoming financial year. Prudential indicators. So as I mentioned to some members earlier, our borrowing activities are managed in accordance with the CIPRA Prudential Code. And these indicators allow us to manage borrowing. As I said before, they're not a definitive set of prescribed limits, and nor are they to be used for inter-authority comparison purposes. They're just our management tool for managing our borrowing activities. And they're set out in Appendix C. Hopefully those prudential indicators are now members understand those, but I'm more than happy to take further questions if not. Just one last thing to say about non-treasury investments. Again, no further property purchases in the last year or so. We know why that is now. Rental income is around about 1.7, 1.8 million, and our return on investment for this year we estimate to be about 6.25%. Again, just to make the point for members that weren't here earlier, we did have a few sort of minimal write-offs of rent arrears in 2021. It was only a few thousand, but we can't rule out future write-offs. And finally, on the economic update, again, I've tried to make that more focused so that it's more relevant to rather than a grand sort of economic update of the economy in general. The outlook is much more positive, but there are certain issues that may bear down on the council. Removal of support packages that were announced through the pandemic or during the pandemic, that may have a knock-on impact on business rate income or council tax payments as well. I'm thinking support packages like the furlough scheme, for example. And finally, the autumn spending announcement may bring further problems to the council, as the government have already outlined in its budget statement in March that there will be likely to be a £4 billion drop in public spending in its spending review to be announced in the autumn. So on the whole, not an awful lot of change from the last quarter, Chair. Hopefully, members will find the report a little bit easier to digest and go through than previous months. And happy to try and take any questions.
Thank you, Chair. In the event that any major property investment displayed in Appendix B might fall, do we have other regeneration possibilities from which we might fill, any potential gap in?
Chair, thanks, Chair. Thank you, Councillor. We have a regular meeting with our colleagues in acquisition transformation services. We're always on the lookout for new opportunities. So, yes, we're always looking for regeneration investment opportunities if they're available.
So, following on from that, Mr. Baden, is there any risk in that area, and if so, to what extent?
There's always risk, and we've been very clear with members about the risk that when we presented the budget and when we presented the medium-term financial plan, there's always risks in those such plans, and we try to identify them as best we can. But we have brought to members' attention several times before that there are risks associated with property deals, as there are associated with any number of issues within the budget, rises in interest rates, for example. So I think we've hopefully spelt that out clearly for members in the past.
Thank you.
Yeah, also just to clarify, I mean, obviously, we haven't incurred any direct costs in relation to the major developments that might have in the future for the council. So in terms of that risk, the risk is that you might not achieve the income to be expected, but the projects will replace the ones if when that might happen.
Thank you.
First, I should have declared an interest here as the chair of the Alliance Homes Brother. And I've got a question about the figures in Appendix B. And I'm curious about what happens in these figures, if you could explain them to me, please. So under the heading Alliance Homes Brother, we have in the 2021-22 budget, and this is in thousands, 25, going up the following year to 37, and then halving the year after that to 18. Could you just give me a bit more detail on that prediction, please? That's all.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very rough estimate, first of all. This programme was approved back in February, and as with other elements of the medium-term financial plan, it's perfectly probable that we will revisit the profile of those figures. So, yeah, we have to report, or we have reported the capital programme as it currently exists. But I think, as we discussed earlier, there will be a further iteration of it, and we'll continue to do that until we, for the rest of our lives, shall we say, we'll always report that. Yeah, that's correct. I mean, there's very little science behind those numbers at the time that we produce them. But as I say, as time progresses, we'll hopefully we will have more information about what the realistic outcome will be.
This may be a very small and significant question in audit terms, but it's important to residents in my ward. In Appendix B, on line 24, it says new bins, and there's an investment of £125,000 a year. Is that because residential bins break and have to be replaced, or is it an investment in bins on high streets or for commercial premises?
Yeah, I mean, these are bins that we collect from residences and I think and businesses as well. I mean, Okay, so just from residential properties, I mean, they have a finite life, I guess. Yeah, you know, I can't really add any more than that. I don't know any more than that. It's they have a finite life. They can be quite breakable, quite easy to break, I would think. And I'd imagine they're quite expensive to replace as well.
That's part of an annual program, like in order to reflect the fact that there will be lots of bins in terms of say breakages, therefore we need to replace. So that just reflects what we think at the moment, like the attrition rate in terms of out there residential households. From memory, for about £20 a go. So.
Thank you. Following on from that, we do have problems in Bexhill Town Centre concerning litter. Now, is it possible for any additional bins or improved bins on the shopping streets in Bexhill Town Centre to be funded out of that budget?
I think it's important to note that this is an audit and standards meeting. It's not a discussion for new services. I think Louisa certainly make a note of that. And, you know, that can certainly be directed to the right people.
Thank you.
I can let you press a button because I don't know. I'm not there's certainly on my team.
Chairman, no, there are no furloughed staff. There was kind of an expectation on the government that we wouldn't go down the furlough scheme.
Any further questions? Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So if I could have a proposer for the treasury management report, please. Councillor Courtell, seconded by Councillor Kirby-Green. Thank you. All in favour? Great, thank you. That's noted. Okay, right. And finally, then we move on to our work programme. So we don't have a meeting in August, so the next one is September. Again, there's no standards reports scheduled for that. But we have got a number of audit reports. Just wanted to highlight the provisional date for November is likely not to happen now, are we saying? So we're going to cancel the November one, and the report from Grant Thornton will be absorbed into the December's meeting. So our next meeting is September, followed by the 6th of December. Any questions on the work programme? No? Okay, that's brilliant. Okay, well, that concludes our audit and standards meeting at 19:50. Thank you very much, everyone, for your questions and contribution. Very much appreciated. Thank you.